Welcome to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Today on the show, John Euler, Dr. Ann Gillies, and Connie Raguli are ready to go. Part 3, if you missed parts 1 and 2, we do recommend you always go back and take a quick view. There is some great information on that with regards to, well, we're going to talk about the child, we're going to talk about the predator, and we're also now going to get into the legal end of things and the investigation side. So let's bring in our experts right now. John Euler, take it away.
Brad, thank you. And Dr. Ann Gillies, thank you for being with us. And I know, like me, this is so compelling. We use that term a lot, but this truly is. And it's rare that we have a legal expert. We have one, Connie. Thank you for joining us. But Ann, for me, I understand the system, but you also, as a therapist, not only do you understand it, but you have walked through this process. So what an invaluable thing to be able to have Connie with us. But it's got to be difficult for you because you've lived this process.
Well, yes, it has been a while ago, thank goodness. I don't think if it was just 2 or 3 years under my belt, I'd be able to do it. But 30 years later, here we are discussing this again. So the investigative process is very interesting. And I just wanted to touch on something that happened in my case, which was really, I think it was good for me to hear. It's an awful thing to think that this is good to hear. But in my case, the investigation process went well. The outcome and the court proceedings did not. And so because of an acquittal, and we can talk about that later if you want, but one of the things the investigating officer, they were also shocked. And that kind of helped me a little bit because they said to me, this was the worst case of sodomy, the worst case of male sexual abuse they had ever encountered. And, you know, here are the officers, you know, they were kind of just taken aback in the same way I was. They were somewhat shocked by the outcome. So they had done tons of work, a lot of work, and spent a lot of time with my son. And so it was hard on them as well. And so the police aren't the villains here. And I'm not saying that the courts are always the villains, but sometimes there are people in the court system that are also not there actually for justice, but do some other things. So I don't want to prolong this, but Connie, let's talk then about how you see the investigative process playing out. And then we're going to talk about what happens in the courtroom itself.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for sharing that, because I have worked as a prosecutor, an actual criminal prosecutor, as well as working in the civil side and just kind of trying to help parents and families through the situation on the civil side. And I was recently involved in a case where a predator got 100 years, got sentenced to 100 years. And it is a case that was torturous over a 4-year period. And so I want to start with this. I know we talked in the first part about the predator and just some of these characteristics of a predator to really help people open their eyes and be aware. And secondly, about the child. What are we looking for in a child? What maybe is that child going through in their own head? And then there's this whole process you have to deal with. And I'm going to say, first of all, when this is initiated, when it starts, every protective parent can't breathe. Okay. They are the trauma of knowing that a child has experienced this takes your breath away. And that is normal. That is something you should experience. You probably, for many reasons, because of the fear, the fright, how did this happen? All those crazy things that go through your mind, especially if the protective parent has been also a victim of domestic violence and been, criticized and put down and put in a very bad place psychologically. So we are always going to have, always, there's going to be this unable to breathe, not know what to do. But the process begins once there is a CPS referral. The process begins with that forensic interview with the child, which is done, which is in almost every state now in the United States. That forensic interview will be able to be used as evidence. Now, the child has to be made available at the trial, but they can actually play that forensic interview. So that is going to be the first report that is closest to the incident. And in law, that's called a fresh report. So it's where they they have the child. The forensic interviewing process has developed over a period of time. I was very fortunate, probably a decade ago, to meet or to work with Dr. Kathleen Fowler, Faller, out of the University of Michigan. And she wrote the first book on the forensic interviewing of children. And she goes through, it's how the forensic interviewer ask the children some questions about the surroundings and to really kind of identify sort of that experience the child was having when that occurred, which there are unfortunately very few really, really good forensic interviewers, but it is recorded and they do ask the children some questions. They try to develop a little bit of rapport. I have seen all of these forensic interviews are under protective orders. As an attorney, I have watched probably 100 of them at least. And of course, I can't share any of them, but I can basically explain what I see in that process. So when we have a child and they'll draw pictures with the child, they'll ask what to identify body parts. They'll ask, have you been touched here? Have you been touched there? Where have you been touched? Have you been touched inappropriately? Kind of examining the language level of the child. So they go through the forensic interview process. Now, I'm just going to say, first of all, DCS may come to your door and want to talk to your child privately as well. But I'm going to say for the parent who is a protective parent, this is not an easy process. This is not easy because here you are as a parent, your child, let's say it's as simple as saying, daddy touched me inappropriately, right? Or I don't like the way daddy touches me. Let's just say it's that simple. I don't like the way daddy touches me. Or daddy, made me come to bed with him. Something, that's it. That maybe that's all the information you have. Now something has happened and you have to turn your child over to somebody you don't know. You don't know if they're going to be competent. You don't know if your child's going to be afraid. You don't know if your child's been threatened or intimidated, not to tell, okay? So for a parent, for everything about being a parent is challenged starting right there. Everything you want to do to protect your child is going to be challenged. And it's horrible. It makes parents sick to their stomach. It gives them anxiety. They don't know how to react. They sometimes become defensive. They challenge that whole process. And only because it's a frightening experience. It does not, and what happens, unfortunately, is sometimes the system turns that around against the parent who is being the protective parent. And now, she was angry when she was there. She didn't want to cooperate with us. And you have all these people, you have this whole system. The child sexual abuse investigation process has become very institutionalized, which is good and bad. The good part is it's institutionalized so that you are getting this coordination of efforts between Child Protective Services, the police department, the detectives, the DA. They have SIPP teams, which are the DA, the investigator, DCS. You have these teams kind of discussing it. But the family's left out of that whole process. The protective parent is left out of that whole process. You have no idea what they're saying. You have no idea what your child said in that forensic interview. You have no idea what notes they're taking about you. You are totally excluded. And then during that process, and I've told parents this many times, you cannot say to your child, did you tell them what happened? You cannot say, Were you, what kind of questions did they ask? You cannot say anything. You cannot say anything to your child. You cannot say, oh, I'm glad you got that off your chest. Oh, I'm glad somebody else is in somebody else's hands now. You cannot say any of that. Because ultimately, when this case goes to a trial, if it gets to a jury trial, the whole defense mechanism of the perpetrator and the defense counsel is going to be to discredit the people that are around that child. Access is, what do they call it? Access is influence, is what they say. And they get up there and they tell a jury, well, this child has been with the mother ever since, blah, blah, blah. This child has been, with the counselor, 20 different times, who's talked to them about this. So the parent cannot say anything. This is a horrible period of time, and it will take months and months and months and even years to get a resolution. So it's the family is left out of that process totally, and nobody checks on their mental health. Nobody checks on how are they handling this? What can we do for the family? And then the family has to face the question of, do I take this child and have the child go to counseling during this process? Well, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Okay, because if you don't take the child to a counselor, the defense is going to say, well, it must not be that damaged, that it must not have been that traumatic, because if it was that traumatic, then the child would have been in consistent counseling. If you do take the child to a counselor consistently, they're like, oh, well, who's taking the child to the counselor? The mother, the protective mother, they're the ones who have all this opportunity. Oh, the protective mother talked to the counselor, before the child talked to the counselor. So you are damned if you do, you are damned if you don't. There's no right answer to that. But you have to, but I say it's important for a child to understand what a counseling relationship is. And so to find somebody who can be trusted, who can just say, look, for a parent to say, I don't know what happened. I know that I'm in a position where I can't delve into it. I just want my child to understand that there are safe people to talk to. And that is absolutely the best step that you can take.
Connie, thank you for describing all this. I have not personally gone through this. And as you indicated, for a parent, so what you've said is, say, if my child discloses, now there's an investigation, that I, as the parent, I can't even talk to my child, ask questions, help them debrief, just to comfort them. Or is what you're saying is the family members, the parents of a child that has been perpetrated against, they literally can't reference this for potentially how long, over what period of time?
You can't until that whether or not the case is going to be prosecuted by a district attorney, and then until the trial. You can't.
Potentially we could be talking how long, where a parent, that's trauma upon trauma for the parent.
Yeah, and the child. And
the child, that's right, because our natural inclination is to comfort our child, to help keep their emotions from being bottled up. So as you indicated, how long can some of these trials take place from disclosure to?
Well, it can take years. It can take 3 or 4 years before that happens. And you're talking about, if you have a child who is offended at 4 or 5 years old, you may be talking about the child being 10 years old and close to puberty before they even have an opportunity to sort of debrief this process with the parent. And that's it's half their life, right? It's half their life. So now my recommendation is, again, for prepubescent children and who are still prepubescent, and it changes. There's a huge shift when you have a child that reaches puberty, huge shift on how you have to deal with everything. But a prepubescent child is, just to normalize their life as much as possible. Because again, going back to us talking about the child, a lot of these children don't understand it so much as sexual aggression. They understand they don't like it. It's uncomfortable. It's some type of affection, sexuality, sexualizing of the child, not necessarily, masochism, or, I mean, it's not necessarily something rough. They're not being tied up. They're not being brutally raped, but they are being groomed, and they are being sexualized, and they are being fondled. And so if a young child, you break the child away from that and they are safe, which is the number one thing. Can you have the child? Can you get the child in a safe situation? Now, the truth of the matter is, if you're going through a divorce, or even if it's a custody case or something, the truth of the matter is that before you ever get to a criminal trial, the parent is going to want to or need to do something to protect the child from the perpetrator. And that's going to require some civil court process even before you get to a criminal court process. And I mean, and I don't know, what to tell you. I have seen cases where civil court judges have heard the children and then still allow the predator to have access to the children, which I've had a psychologist explain a particular situation to me. And ultimately, when she testified in front of the criminal trial, and the defense attorney said to her, well, isn't it true another judge heard this child and allowed access? And the counselor said, I was horrified. I was horrified. Now, that's a very good situation where the divorce court judge did not totally 100% believe the child, but the jury believed the child. And ultimately, I mean, what is a good prosecutor? And I know, and you obviously had a bad situation with the prosecutor. I would say most prosecutors hate these cases. Most of them hate these cases because, first of all, they don't want to talk about it. They don't want this topic. They don't want to cover this topic. They would rather be trying a drug deal, something that's more black and white and doesn't have all this gruesome facts to it. They don't want to have to depend on a child witness who you never know what they're going to say. They're not the kind of cases they want to try. So have I seen them basically throw cases? I absolutely have. I've seen that happen. But if you have there's a handful of attorneys, of district attorney, prosecuting attorneys that I've ever met in my whole career, my whole 30 years career, that understands how to prosecute these cases and understand that either a jury is either going to believe the child or not. But if you can keep the case pure, if you can keep it pure and just have it on the child's testimony and not allow the defense attorney to clutter it up with a lot of other things, then you're going to be able to at least have a shot.
So I think what you're saying is really, really important. I think in my own case, and see, this is 30 years ago. My son reported to us when he was 11. It had begun before he was 2 years old. And we didn't know about the other children until much later because they didn't come forward, even though this one son had. They just, anyways, the long story short, the Crown and there were other victims prior to my son that's all came out during the investigation. The Crown only used my son's testimony, saying that it was so strong that they didn't need anyone else. And then, of course, the judge's words, and John's heard me say this, the judge's word, after my son had been at court for 3 days, and at that point they had to testify on the stand. He was by that time 13. So John, there's an answer to your question. It was 2 years getting to trial, and he was 13. So here's this young teen having to testify. So in our case, I'll never forget the judge's words. Now, my son that day, the day that the verdict came down, had asked, you're talking about normalizing. He had said it was his grade 8 graduation. And he said, Mom, can I just go on my grad trip? And I said, absolutely. You go be, just be a kid, as much as he could. Anyways, but the judge said these words, Connie, and I wonder if you've ever heard these before. He said, because we didn't have a jury. I mean, what did I know back then? I knew nothing about all the court process. We had a judge, and he said, I totally believe everything your son said. And I'm like, oh, the weight is going off. And then he said, but I can't totally disbelieve everything your former husband said. And I talk about shock. I'm like, how can you be so double-minded? And the things my son had to talk about on the stand were so graphic. It was so graphic. It's so invasive and so traumatizing. I was just so angry at this judge because he'd heard all of these things, angry at the system, but really, really angry at my ex-husband for allowing our son to be put through that. That was so horrifying because he didn't care. All that was of concern to him really was that I get off scot-free. And that's exactly what happened. There is a judgment coming, but that was so demoralizing. It was so traumatizing, and it was very, very it was life-changing for my son too at that age. It was horrific.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely is. And and putting these children in the courtroom, and they will have to go in the courtroom. There's just no way around it. They will have to go into the courtroom. And and then once you get, I mean, let's just say you're waiting and waiting and waiting for a trial, and let's say it's 2.5, 3 years later, and then all of a sudden you get the call from the district attorney that the case is going to trial, and then you have to take that child, you have to pick up that child, you have to take that child to the district attorney, and again, by parents who've not been able to talk to their children about this for years. And that's terrifying to the child again. And then of course the DA talks to them alone, and the parents are totally left out of the loop. I mean, nobody has really will even really say to the parents, this is this is a concern we have, this is a report we have, but this whole thing in particular about the parents going through this process being angry or upset or frustrated, and then this whole investigative system documenting that as being parents who are trying to obfuscate or who are trying to defeat the system when really they're just afraid. They're just afraid. So I want to also go. Don't want to forget this part, and this was kind of out of timeline here, but when the child is taken to that first interview, they may not disclose. Okay. Now we know, we talked about that. It's recorded, it's on videotape. It's a new experience for a child. They don't know what it is. Again, depending on the age of the child, it's kind of a very artificial experience too. They are in rooms that are about maybe 10 by 8 feet. They have no windows in them. They have this funky sort of plastic covered furniture, and then they have cameras. And then they also have a two-way mirror where somebody can watch what they're saying, and they will tell the children, like, somebody's watching you over there, so it's a very unnatural experience, and it's not unusual for the first time for a child not to disclose because of that setting. So if you have a child who does not disclose initially, what's going to happen? That child is going to be put back in the same situation. That child is going to be re-victimized. And that's a whole nother psychology for the child. And I have found, though, that sometimes that's a period of time where having that outside counselor, being able to work with the child from that point of when the investigation is open until you get to a point where, so the counselor can meet the child, the counselor can talk to the child, and then they can do a forensic interview. That counselor can continue to meet with the child again, so that child understands that third party safe relationship. And then if they do have to be exposed again to the perpetrator, and unfortunately I've seen this happen, I know this happens, and then when they are perped on again, the child has more of a sense of emboldenment. They have more of a sense of lack of tolerance now, because they have begun to understand that this is not acceptable, that this is not appropriate, that there are people who will talk to me about this. And I have seen that is the time where a child, even if they did not disclose the first time, the second time, where they've almost discovered they've had to go back into that situation, they'll spill their guts. They will absolutely spill their guts in detail, tell the whole thing. And when they do, and you continue with that psychologist or that therapist, that child has a sigh of relief. And the child has a sigh of relief. And then, honestly, they don't want to talk about it anymore. They're done. They've said it. They're done. They don't understand they're going to have to continue to go to this process until we get through the trial process and criminal court and stuff. They don't understand that. But there is this huge relief off of a child who's been victimized once they have told that story.
Connie, gosh, what you're describing, right? The trauma upon trauma of these children and the families. I have a situation that I'm one of the guys in my sex offender treatment program. I have no doubt, because what he disclosed, and I've seen the police report, there were allegations against him early on by his wife, who eventually got into drugs. Well, I can only imagine why. There was an investigation and it was unfounded. And now this 10-year-old girl is transitioning to a boy. We can only wonder why she doesn't want to be a girl, but because mom got into drugs, guess who now has custody of the kid? So I have a guy in my sex offender treatment group right now who, while describing his situation, and they never describe it accurately, references the child who he wants me to refer to. We don't get into family dynamics too much as far as immediate family in sex offender treatment, because most of them don't have access to their kids, right? But this guy, there were allegations that he perped on this kid. The kid is now in his sole custody, and this girl now wants to be a boy. That's how this connects with the trans movement, that these men, the more sophisticated ones, sometimes will stop perping on their own child, but they're going to continue. But they knew they had a close call, so they're going to stop perpetrating. That dynamic's even worse now, because you've got that love-hate dynamic within the child. Child still wants to have a dad, but now the child has so suppressed the anger that they've turned it in on themselves, right? So now you have a child that is hating their body. We hear the term dead name within the trans movement. That means they're burying their old self. It must be that my problem was that part of me. What have you seen? You know, I'm seeing expression on your face. So we've got perpetrators that know how to work it, and you have kids then that have to bottle this stuff up.
Well, so this is where I have to say I'm not a psychologist, although I play one obviously on podcast. But I have a deep inquiring mind on this. So I have seen, because I've seen, of course, the trans movement has seemed, of course, has exploded over the past year or two. And over my 3 decades, it was not about trans, but it certainly was about dysfunction, adult dysfunction in a huge way. And as you know, I also acted as a divorce attorney, and you mentioned bipolar disorder earlier. And I have definitely, you know, seen 40-year-old women who are struggling with functioning in society and have sometimes said, "What happened to you when you were 12 or 13?" And have disclosed to me that they were abused. I mean, and have shared that. So I know, we know. I mean, we know that aggression, that sexual aggression against a child does something to them. We know, based upon everything we've talked about over the past 2 segments, and then today, all of that anxiety of dealing with a perpetrator and all of these nuanced behaviors the aggressions, the stalking, all of those things, and then finding out that they are indeed a perpetrator, and that shock of how did I let that happen, that anxiety for the child of being in an uncomfortable situation and told not to tell. I mean, it is such a plethora of emotions that are coming from all different angles, that there's no way you can walk out of that normal. I mean, there's no way. So if this is moving, the children that are trans, that are being treated as trans children and gender dysphoria, until we know where that comes from, I don't believe, I read a blog the other day where a mom said, my 8-year-old came up and told me, my little 8-year-old girl came up and told me she was a boy. And I'm like, and she's like, okay, so she starts giving her hormones. So nobody asked that question of that child. Why are you thinking that? How do you feel about that? Nobody's exploring that. So I know there's many different routes to it. I don't know all of them. I just know based upon my experience, I'm very concerned, and I feel very comfortable saying that incestuous behavior within the home place is one of the factors that are leading and fueling the trans movement.
If the listeners were like me and Ann right now, we're overwhelmed, just thinking about we work with survivors all the time, but as we hear again the pathos that these kids go through, it pulls at your heartstrings. Will you be good enough to come back and we'll continue another time?
Yes, and I would like
information.
Yeah, and what we have done since today, we've through these segments, we've talked about the perpetrator, the child, and the process. I really would like for us now, with all of that on our hearts and minds, to have a discussion about how all those things kind of come together, and what we want the public to know and understand, and how to use that information so maybe we can help our kids.
That sounds really good, and I've just been so pleased talking with you, Connie. I think you've really fleshed out the process, both for the perpetrator, what goes on with them, for the child, and then for the protective parent. I think it's been a really, really good 3 sessions. I think people are going to be really informed moving forward.
Remember, it's not our kids' fight, it's our fight, so make sure you stand up today. Take note. This is Unmasking the Trans Movement. I'm Brad Wilder. We'll see you next time.